hopefully I've given you enough time here to read through the entire chapter, or at least most of it. So give me a little bit of background here. How did Joseph end up in Egypt? How did Joseph end up there in Egypt? I see your hands. I am ignoring you. I see your hands. I'm looking for some people I haven't seen hands from that I know this answer. Maybe you're just so ingrained in reading, I didn't give you quite enough time. Yes, sir. Okay, his brothers sold him into slavery. Where did he and his brothers live when they sold him for a slave? Yeah, they're in Canaan. So Canaan was north of Egypt, along the Mediterranean, modern-day Israel. And they decided they were going to sell him. Why did they sell him? They were jealous of him. Okay, I'm going to come back to that question here, why, a lot in this. So I want you to be thinking, okay, why? All right, they didn't want to kill him. They wanted to make a little profit off him. They were jealous of him. Joseph is one of my favorite Bible characters. You want to guess why he is one of my favorite Bible characters? No, it's not, but that's a good guess. Throughout the story of Joseph, you'll notice that he carries himself with integrity. I realize we didn't take the time to go back and to study earlier parts of Joseph's life, but from what you remember when you hear about this in church or you learn about it in Sunday school, did Joseph complain against God when he was sold from his family into slavery? No. Would you complain if your siblings sold you off into slavery? Yeah, yes. If you into slavery? Okay. Slavery. Okay, it's not just like an uncomfortableness. This is you are forced into labor or forced to do things against your will for no pay. Now, I'm sensing some distraction, so for right now, let's put our laptops down. We'll come back to them in just a moment. So with Joseph, he gets sold into slavery, no complaining. He trusts that God has a plan, even though he doesn't see it. He doesn't know what's going to happen. What happens when he gets to Egypt? What do those slave traders do? They sell him again, and he goes into whose house? Go to Potiphar's house. Okay, Potiphar's an important guy, but he was not the guy. He was not Pharaoh. What happens in Potiphar's house? Okay, Potiphar's wife sees Joseph, and she's got a crush on him. And she wants to, when Potiphar is gone, she wants to entice him into the bedroom. And Joseph says, no. This, to me, is one of the most amazing parts of the story, is the fact that he said no. Would anybody have known? Potiphar was gone. Potiphar's wife was there. Certainly they had other servants. But if Potiphar's wife was enticing him, she would have made sure that they were alone. Nobody else would have been there. She would not have wanted to be caught because, as we study Egyptian culture, women were held in high regard to a point. But if they didn't submit and if they didn't do what the men wanted them to do, then they could lose their status, lose their position. So this was not something where she would have went and told everybody. This would have been very secretive. Could Joseph have gotten away with it from our perspective? Just looking at the circumstances, I think he could have. And of course, we don't know what might have happened because that's not what actually did happen. We don't know. God could have chosen to reveal it some other way. Shows his integrity. And I'm humbled every time I think about that at the times where I sin behind closed doors and I sin and have these secret things and I think nobody's ever going to find out. And yet Joseph had that same proposition. He could have sinned, given into the easy thing. Nobody would have ever known, and yet he didn't. Josh? Yeah. Now, He says no to Potiphar's wife. What happens to him then? Okay, he gets thrown into prison. Yes, sir. Okay, so Potiphar's wife is angry, so she frames Joseph, which Potiphar liked Joseph. He could have just killed him right there, but he didn't. He instead chose to put him into prison. He sits in the prison for a while. He meets a baker and he meets a butler, and he still sits and rots in prison. Then we catch up here to the story in Genesis chapter 41. And how does Joseph end up making it back out of prison? Emma? Yes. So we have somebody far greater than Potiphar. We have the Pharaoh of Egypt. Guys, let's focus. Pharaoh of Egypt getting wind of, here's a guy that can help interpret my dream. He goes, he interprets a dream. And again, I still ask, why do you think God put him through all of that? Why did God allow all these bad things to happen to him? And it seemed for a while, like you're in Potiphar's house, you're in charge of all the other servants. Life was good. And then he goes back to prison. Why do you think? JC? Okay. I think that's always a good way to look at it. So God can show his power. Why else do you think perhaps he allowed that to happen, Micah? To test Joseph and to see, is he going to remain faithful? Is he going to show integrity? And again, I'm not trying to preach to you, but if you feel like you're being preached to, it's never a bad thing. Okay, it's the Word of God. It's important. How are we showing integrity when nobody else is watching? Is God giving us tests? Are we passing the test when nobody else is watching? Now, historically, I can ask that question, why did all this happen? Well, we know that there was a famine that came in the land of Egypt, and the Bible tells us that here in Genesis chapter 41. History also tells us that there was a massive famine going through Africa in 1656 BC. There was a significant drought in Egypt, and that would have been overlapping with the time that Joseph was in Egypt. Some say that's coincidence, some say that's providence of God. I land on the providence of God side. And we can also look at some of the engravings and the hieroglyphics. What does this look like to you? How would you interpret this? What do you think's happening here? What? Okay, looks like they could be building something. They typically put building materials and heavy rocks on top of your head. What do you think?
Water, maybe?
Maybe water. Okay. Perhaps a dungeon. Going down to something.
But then there's the guy writing something.
Yeah, you've got a guy there overseeing. It looks as though he is planning for something. And then archaeologists discovered this as well. And I realize that the shadows don't necessarily reveal that quite as well, but this is what they unearthed beneath the sand, and they found stairways very similar to the way that picture represented. And down here they found massive storage bins. They were not watertight, so it was not water. Most likely, that would have been the storage silos that Joseph would have constructed. Perhaps that picture we saw just a moment ago could have even been Joseph himself sitting there overseeing all of this happening. And God put him in charge, and I think that's, once again, a testament to Joseph and his integrity and his character, because God allowed for this outsider, this foreigner, to be put up into second in command in all of Egypt, in Pharaoh's household. Well, the Middle Kingdom does come to an end. There's a group of people by the name Hyksos that they come into Egypt and they invade, but they don't invade to conquer. Now, the Hyksos were known for their military tactics. They were known for their weapons. And they come into Egypt and they see the Egyptian people and they say, man, you guys have a lot going on here. You got a lot of people. Let us teach and train and tell you how to fight. And so they begin doing that. The Hyksos came in with iron weapons and chariots and swords, and the Egyptians didn't have any of that type of stuff. Why do you think they didn't have any of that?
It's a desert.
Okay, desert, so...
It's hard to get stuff like that.
Okay, yeah, they're not going to have access to resources for that. Why else would they not have had weapons? What? It was a time of peace. And furthermore, who's going to come attack them? They're a long ways away from everybody. So, right. Now, the Hyksos are training them, and they're saying, hey, who are those foreigners? Because as we go throughout the generations, Joseph brings his brothers down. They start having families, and now all the Hebrews are living amongst the Egyptian, and the Hyksos go, who are these foreigner people over here? Oh, well, those are the Hebrews. Well, are they your slaves? No. Are they citizens? No. But they outnumbered the Egyptians. And so the Hyksos are most likely those that gave the suggestion to enslave the Hebrews because they were so powerful and so numerous. The Hyksos said, listen, if you want to be a powerful empire, you cannot have foreigners living next to you without having control over them. So make them your slaves, show them who's boss, and then you'll not have to worry about an uprising. Now, we need to make sure we get to the last golden age here too. Sam?
Why did the Hyksos, or whatever they're called, help them?
Because the Hyksos were not powerful enough to conquer them, but they wanted to be a part of a great empire. So they saw Egypt as having the resources and having the manpower. They saw how the people loved their leadership, and they said, listen, if we work together, we could build a great empire. And really the Hyksos end up assimilating and kind of merging in with the Egyptians anyway. New Kingdom is, again, another 500 years, known as the Age of the Empire. And I think it's humbling to think that we've now talked about almost 1,500 years of Egyptian history in the last 25, 30 minutes. You're going to spend an entire year talking about 275 years of American history when you get to your junior year. America has not existed as long as only one of these golden ages. We've not even existed hardly half of one of these golden ages of Egypt. That shows you how big and how significant Egypt was. Yes, ma'am? Nope. I will tell you if there's a specific date you need to know. Otherwise, these are just giving you a perspective in all of this. So this is known as the Age of the Empire. Under the influence of the Hyksos, as well as the emperors themselves or the pharaohs themselves, they take what was once Old Egypt, Middle Egypt, and they expand it into an empire, where they are going to now have influence on a global level. There are a few pharaohs I want to bring to your attention. The first one is Hatshepsut. She is a woman. Why would I make a point to emphasize that? First female, yeah, and really the first significant woman other than Eve that appears onto history. Most nations, most city-states were ruled by men. So Hatshepsut is the first significant female leader in Egypt. And Exodus chapter 2 talks about the story of Moses. Now, Moses was an infant. He was put into a basket. What then happened after he was put in the basket in the Nile? Princess found him. Okay? If we look at the timeline of Moses, compare that with his heritage in the Bible, as well as compare it with the timeline of Egyptian rulers, there is an overlap. There is some pretty strong evidence that Hatshepsut was the Egyptian princess that rescued Moses out of the Nile. She then grew up. Her father died. There was no male heir to the throne. So she ended up taking over as pharaoh for a short period of time, about 30 years or so. And she ended up ruling in a time of peace and prosperity. And her greatness could be linked to her mercy that she showed to Moses. Now, When she passes off the scene, her half-brother, Thutmose III, takes over. He was not nearly as merciful, not nearly as gracious, and he came in with the idea that he was going to make a name for himself and make a name for Egypt. He believed his half-sister was way too lenient. She was way too kind, although she was a very strong-willed woman. And he comes in and starts to rule almost with an iron fist. And there is a high possibility that this would have been the Pharaoh when Moses killed the Egyptian. You guys remember that story? Okay, so Moses kills an Egyptian, and he knows that Thutmose is on the throne, and he is ruthless, showing no mercy. Do you understand now why he fled out of Egypt and ran away? Okay, so that is, if that all lines up. Now I'm telling you this also with a little bit of skepticism just because there's some dates we can't verify for sure. However, a lot of things point to that. Sam?
Was the iron fist tactic or the merciful tactic better for Egypt? Or do we really know?
Well, that depends on what you mean by better. The iron fist grew them into a feared and conquering type nation. The merciful made them more friendly toward their neighbors, made them more prosperous in a friendly manner. The iron fist made them prosperous because they went and took. So it depends on, I guess, what you're defining as better for them. Both were successful, but in the leadership of Thutmose, he continued the harsh slavery of the Hebrew people, and that eventually leads us to Amenhotep. Despite what some of the movies will tell you, it was probably not Ramses that was the guy who endured all the plagues. It was most likely Amenhotep that endured all of that. So, yes, sir? Not right now. Just hold on for a minute. So it's most likely Amenhotep that he was the guy who endured the 10 plagues, including the fact that his oldest child died, and Egyptian record shows that Amenhotep had a powerful empire, and then it suddenly collapsed. An Egyptian record doesn't tell us why, but it just says he was powerful, and then it fell apart, and it also shows that he had no male heir to take over after he was deceased, which again would point to, well, what was that massive collapse? Was it the plagues? Was it the lack of the Hebrew people being there? God's intervention? I would argue yes. Then we have Ramses. Now Ramses II, he kind of rebuilds a lot of the empire back after the Hebrews leave. So Ramses II starts reconstructing a lot of the temples and a lot of the Egyptian historical marks and all those things that we associate now with Egypt today.